I think one crucial question in this piece is the relationship between dance and language. So maybe you could say a word about that.
So as I said before, this is one part of a bigger research that deals with this relationship between dance and language. What does it mean? Yesterday I found a word very interesting, and I think that this word expresses a bit my feeling. And this word is necrotizing.
Necrotizing?
Yes.
What does it mean?
You can also say flesh eater. So for example, in medical term, you have a necrosis when you have a virus or an infection that eats up your flesh. And
nice.
And this was to express. Sometimes I have the feeling that dance theory is necrotizing dance, and so language is used in a way that is eating the flesh, so to say. So my idea, my frustration, and my desire was to learn to use language in another way, in a poetical way, in an emancipatory way, not to flatten dance or make a linear meaning about what we see, but to let also dance for what it is, and maybe accompany dance in another way, because I think this relation between dance and language is very strong, and it's a bond that is there, and it's also very interesting, all the discourse and theory, but I wanted to try to use, to dig in a lot of questions that are in relation to dance and language, for example, translation, interpretation, passing material one to another, description, or everything that is around dance and is around meaning, but it's not one fixed, especially fixed, not moving thing. So I prefer to use language in utterance, in movement, I mean language that is not defining one meaning above all. So this was kind of my personal desire to start this research, and also what does it mean, for example, to put rhythm in language? So to use dance logics in language and verbal logics in dance.
Right, because I think one of the problems with this excessive theorization of dance is that people lose access to the work, that they use a direct, personal, intimate access to what they're seeing, right? And I think that this is something that the film dramatizes really in really cool ways in many places. I really like the way in which you play with absurdity. Is that something you want to talk about, maybe?
I think it's something that is in my work, and it's something that is important to actually break hierarchies, and then put, for example, things all at the same level, and then use this reference of the phone, which is like this mythical reference, but treat it really as another material. And also this thing of putting together things that they don't necessarily correspond or fit. And this is also a formal choice that we made in order really to create space between things, so that something else can emerge, something else that is unknown to me or to Christophe as author, and it's kind of leaving this, we have this interval, interstice. When we were working, we were talking about floors instead of levels, or someone would call it planes, so then we go into more philosophical. But for us, floors are like a pavement, but also apartment floors. So in a way, it's not just to flatten things, but there is a space in between. And in this space in between, there is something else that is up to the reader or the spectator of dance, that is of dance and of the movie, this up to the spectator.
Yeah, for us it was interesting the last days when we were reading your book that we found a lot of things back of the process that we were working, like this opacity, for example, which is in the movie, it's this thing of putting different layers on top versus transparency and, like what Sara was saying, these levels. And I don't know, maybe it's more a question to you, because maybe we also want to contextualize ourselves in this festival of feminism, especially me, I want to contextualize myself in this festival of feminism. Maybe from your side to hear about this, if there is like a formal element or something that you recognize in this. Or
So I wrote my book about 4 women filmmakers and 3 philosophers, and I was really interested in the way in which these, all 3 were art filmmakers. And I was interested in the ways in which they were mobilizing the aesthetics of art cinema, which are different from the aesthetics of mainstream cinema, to do something that I thought was very feminist, even though the movies themselves couldn't really be seen as feminist, you know, like radical political movies. And so I studied the aesthetic devices that they were deploying in ways that I thought were really useful and really interesting for feminism, because they created a space in which difference could operate, in which alterity could find a space to live and breathe. In particular, I was interested in, so the book was a dialogue between film and philosophy. I was interested in putting aesthetic devices and philosophical concepts in a dialogue with each other. And the main concept that occupied me was a concept called the interval by a Belgian philosopher named Lucie Regaray. And the interval is a really cool concept to think about art, because it is about space and time, and a lot of art is about space and time. The interval is the very, very small temporal and spatial interstice that comes between 2 people so they can have a relationship that is not hierarchical, but that is a relationship in which they can both exist as subjects, as opposed to one person being a subject and the other person being an object. This is a relationship in which both partners can have a space of their own, as opposed to one person functioning as a space on which the other can develop typically his subjectivity. So I was tracing aesthetic devices in film that were performing forms of interval, that were enabling the possibility of difference, of a difference without hierarchy, to emerge either within the film itself or in the relation between the film and the spectator. And so I was really interested in the film in seeing many instances of aesthetic devices that were performing something similar. I was really interested in the editing, the layered editing. So the way you guys edit is, well, editing is always temporal, of course, but it's also spatial. Like, you put planes on top of one another. And this creates a space in which difference can really operate, in which difference becomes very visible because you have 2 images that do not match at all. So art cinema often uses editing in ways that are destabilizing for the audience. So, you know, in mainstream cinema, traditional classical mainstream cinema, you're not supposed to notice the editing. It's supposed to be completely seamless. So you forget you're watching a movie. Art cinema often reminds you that you're watching a movie. This is like the classical Jean-Luc Godard trick of the jump cut, right? They use editing to remind you that, oh, look, this is actually art. But you guys bring these editing techniques way further, with a layering of different planes, of different images that make the artificiality and really the texture of the film very evident. And what really struck me upon watching the film for the third time was how funny this editing, this layered editing was, and how aptly you were using the absurdity to put us, I think, for me at least, to put me face to face with the limits of interpretation. How it became very complicated for me to interpret a piece, a scene, as, you know, critically trying to think of it and putting words on it, when it was just really funny in really absurd ways, in ways that spoke to the senses much more than they spoke to the mind. But usually when art films speak to the senses, they put us in this quizzical, mysterious position, which your film does, but it's also funny. So in terms of embodiment as a spectator, it's very different to have this sense of being tickled by the film, of having something absurd and quizzically funny happening.
I think that in one way we also wanted, if it's a film, but it's also a dance piece for us, and in a way there is this really haptic feeling, or it's almost like the dance is in you. It's maybe not live here, but it works more for the spectator. And we also have another question for you that is related to dance. And it is, in these films you choose to analyze, there is always dance. Yep. And I think that dance is also something that is interesting for you.
Yeah.
So we wanted to know why or what.
I think dance is really interesting because dance shows you the becoming of the other in ways that other art forms don't. So in dance, you're put face to face with something very mysterious and something very unattainable in the other. Basically movement, that's which you can never master or analyze. You can only look at it. And so I find that to be really fascinating in dance, the unfolding of the other's becoming, which I think is a very feminist thing. It is to behold the other's mystery and to let it exist in its mystery is something that can very easily belong to feminism. I would like to, yes, I think the figure of the faun should be addressed.
So the faun, I guess you understood, so there is a reference of a mythical ballet of 1912 that actually comes from a poem of Mallarmé and then was made into music by Debussy, and then much later was Cocteau wrote the argument for Nijinsky ballet. It's a ballet of 10 minutes, I think, and it tells the story of a faun, so half man, half goat, that wakes up after his afternoon sleep, after his siesta, and basically he said he tried to reconstruct his dream. He met those nymphs, and one of them left a cloth, forgot a cloth. So there is this narcotic and hallucinogenic dream-like atmosphere. But of course, there's a lot to do with the moment of creation, like how desire can create. So it's also about art. Then, of course, as it's said in the film, there is there is a relation between. For me, it's more like between art and nature, but there is Apolloniac and Dionysiac. It's very erotic, the thing, the ballet. And then formally, it's like two-dimensional. It really takes a lot of influence from this Greek base. And the movement, they are almost in one plane. We are during the research, we arrived to this, we passed through different historical ballet, and this really was kind of coming together, was the good example, because it was a solo, because it was this dream-like state, that for me was this idea of touching the sense, like how dance can touch you, be very sensorial, etc. And then, of course, this figure is double. There is a man with a female wig and a woman with kind of weird other wig.
In our version.
In our version, yeah. And it's also, I think, one of the pieces that was, they have a lot of interpretation during the years. So for us, it was like, it came really as a good tool to be in the movie and talk about what we wanted. Also the fact that it's actually a poem originally, and in the poem, Mallarmé is really breaking with a lot of rules, and is using space. And also in the poem, for example, there are some imperative of the faun talking to himself and trying to say, remember, what was it? So it's like a reformulation of his dream in a poetic version. So with all this idea of interpretation, it was really fitting. And it's also very absurd. Yeah. It looks absurd, and there are all this, this bidimensionality, like a frieze. It touches to certain also topic that we were talking about, this 3D, 2D, decorative. So there are a lot of other layers that we were interested in, and then the faun was really the representation, or like the formally was interesting because of this.
Yeah, and the poem itself completely defies any interpretation. Like, it's really hard to understand, even for a French speaker. And Mallarmé's poetry, I mean, that's typical for Mallarmé's poetry at large. So the poem, in a way, dramatizes exactly what you're doing in the film as well. So it questions the possibility of interpretation. And then, just to say, there is another reference that is the Paolo Uccello, that for us was also the paintings that is in the movie, and there is this attempt to create depth with the very artificial techniques.
Fake perspective. Okay.
Yes, and at the end there is someone describing a movie. It's a movie of Arrebato, and it's a movie that is about this moment of rapture. Rapture in the sense of intense, like being taken by a moment of intense joy or passion. And for me, this was kind of the last part, and it becomes this vampiric chapter.
Yeah, in which the spectator ceases to exist and becomes pure feeling and pure intensity. And right?
Exactly.
Exactly. Okay, great. Maybe we can take a couple of questions from the audience, or do we have time? 5 minutes? Okay, great. So if someone has a comment or a question, now is the time.
Or later at the bar, also possible.
No, I don't even have questions. So.
Okay, good. Then we're done. Thank you very much. Oh,
there
there
no,
is one question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
can say. It's not the first time because I've been doing music for Sara's pieces for 13 years now, I think. And with different other people working with Sara, etc. But this movie, I think it came together. But first, there was the research of Sara, which was the research of, let's simply said, language and dance and this more or less. Which the idea from the beginning was to film it, but not necessarily to make this kind of movie. But we also arrived to this technology of 3D for several reasons, which is also explained in the paper that people gave to you. And so, yeah, I think I got more involved also technically. And soon, I also worked on films before and making cinema or attempts to cinema, let's say. And we just started to make it together, like just practically make it. And like, for example, the formal elements like the editing, etc., became so important, the sound became so important, the technology of the 3D and trying to play with it. Like sometimes the 3D works, sometimes it doesn't work. It's very fake. 3D is anyway a difficult kind of medium. It's not really a good cinema medium. But so we worked in this way, and the more and more we worked on it over these 2 years, I think it became more a project of us together. So.
And I think that there is one element that was present since the filming and then in the editing that is really kind of playing with not knowing, because the two cameras that we have, they don't have a screen. So I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of the frames, they are like the head is cut. They are very weird, which is difficult to do it that way because you would normally normalize the frame. So these two cameras, they don't have a screen, so it's always like blindly filming. Also, during the research, it was 1 year of interviewing a lot of people, and without really knowing exactly, like asking to describe pieces, how do you use language to describe a piece, how did you use language to describe what you were doing in a piece or your interpretation. Then there is the dictation, so there are different ways of using language.
Which also exists as an archive. No.
Yeah, it also exists as an archive. But there was really this feeling of not knowing very well. And then in the editing, sometimes we really try out things and have the feeling that was right, if it was right or not right. So we try like different images, and then I would do an edit and then give it to him, and he would say, no, no, it doesn't feel right. And we would do this all the time. And I think that this also is kind of, another, actually reading the book of Caroline, this also not knowing or the author put himself in a position where he is not explaining his view of a topic or of the world. It's more like showing something that is there, of course in a very personal way. Of course there are a lot of choices, but there is this part of amateur, I don't know, but not knowing or let things come by itself. Let also unexpected things coming out.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Please leave your glasses in the little box by the door, and for the people who still have time, we're having a drink downstairs in the bar. Thank you, Sara, Christophe, Caroline.
Ciao. Va bene.